we'll go ahead and jump in here, I think. Everybody should have got materials last week from Jenna, and on behalf of OSU and Shannon and the team. But really the agenda, we've got a couple hours today. We'll save some time at the end for public comment. If you're a member of the public and interested in making public comment, please send me a chat. We'll make sure to get you in the queue. And I'll save just a little bit of time here after I do this introductory remarks for any just general updates from folks. But most of the time here really is focused on Shannon walking through the timeline and deliverables and then reviewing the table of contents. We thought it would be helpful for folks to take a look back, and that was stuff that we had worked on with input from all of you a number of months ago, and we wanted to revisit that, see if there's any updates or any additional reflections on that, and then focus on any feedback on the timeline and deliverables with a specific eye to the two questions that are included on the agenda. But really, are there key sections of the FMP that folks want to see or need to see delivered by December of 2022 in that draft? And then what information is needed in the draft document from your perspective? And we'll focus the conversation on those two key questions and look for your feedback. And then, as I say, we'll have some time reserved at the end for public comment. We'll wrap up and get you out of here no later than 11 o'clock this morning. And with that said, any questions on the agenda or just general updates from folks from the committee?
All right. I have to step away for a bit right off the bat this morning, but I'll be right back. But I'll leave my my Zoom running. So
great.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom. And Shannon, I think you're up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So as Peter mentioned, you should have gotten a couple of materials last week. A draft timeline, which we can walk through this morning, as well as a draft table of contents that has the input that we've received so far incorporated into it. What we wanted to do this morning was walk through the steps of that timeline rather than immediately digging into that big spreadsheet that we shared with you, walking through what those steps look like with an example, and then digging into the discussion questions that Peter outlined. So that's where we're going today. So this is a picture of the spreadsheet that you all received. Of course, you can't read it in this version. As I said, we can dig into it a little bit later if you'd like to in more detail. But this is the draft timeline that we shared. We will be talking more about this timeline as well as the intersection of this development timeline with the FMP engagement plan at the December 15th advisory committee meeting. But just wanted to highlight a couple of things here, which you've probably noticed if you've had a chance to look at the Excel sheet. There are color-coded workflows for different parts of the FMP development process, and you can see that they're all sort of running alongside each other. And so in many cases, a result or an output or a piece of information from one piece of this will feed into another step or help refine another piece. And so the major areas here, they're broken down by month, they're color-coded with the steps up here and the drafting milestones down here, and then sort of reflected in these color-coded timelines down here. But you can see it's a combination of data collection, analysis, and management. That's the blue. Purple is modeling. We have experimental design, including the key research projects that were outlined in the research proposal, a landscape analysis, adaptive management, a monitoring plan, the integrating with the HCP and the conservation strategy for the forest, and then a financial section, which includes revenue generation strategy and financial analysis. And then running alongside all of this is the work going into drafting the FMP. So it really is a series of feedback loops from these different workflow processes that are happening at the same time. And so keeping this draft development timeline in mind, today we would like to walk through an example of how the steps outlined in the scope of work fit together, and then have a discussion with the working group and get your feedback as a group about the information that will be important to include in that partial draft of key sections in December 2022, as has been outlined in our scope of work. And so just to start off by bringing us back to the big picture, the experimental design, this triad. The triad, experimental design, and the research platform, the FMP will detail how the Elliott State Research Forest will achieve the objectives outlined in the research proposal, and how decisions will be made, management strategies to sustainably manage the forest and achieve the research vision that's outlined in that research proposal, as well as the information in the habitat conservation plan. And so I know that you've seen this figure and this map many times, but just wanted to bring us back to an overview of what we're working on with this management plan for the Elliott, with our system of reserves, both in the CRW here, and then in the MRW, the management research watersheds and conservation research watersheds, and then the riparian conservation areas. And then this breakdown within the management research watersheds of reserve with intensive, extensive, Triad E and Triad I. And we have approximately 2/3 of the forest in reserve, 17% in intensive and 16% in extensive, based on the analysis that was done in the research proposal. So now that we're in the forest management plan process, what we're looking at is fine scale tuning, reviewing and adjusting the assignments and the initial set of criteria based on some additional information. And this includes incorporating information from an updated inventory and ecological data. And we'll talk a little bit more about the types of data that are being brought together, some data that we already have, as well as new data that we'll be needing. We are also looking at additional stakeholder and partner input. This includes addressing feedback from the conservation community about several specific watersheds that we've received, as well as working with local partners such as watershed councils. We've had input over concerns about how to address steep slopes, and that's a part of this analysis as well as continuing to bring in local experts in addition to other partners and stakeholders, and that includes forest managers and research forest directors that we're also consulting with. And we're also consulting on the best way to work collaboratively with a broad range of groups during this process and in the overall research mission of the Elliott. This also includes continuing to work with Indigenous communities to ensure that appropriate care is taken to avoid culturally significant areas and spiritual places, as well as I mentioned, this landscape analysis, incorporating any updated data that we have, running that analysis through modeling and incorporating additional analysis and input from researchers and individuals, including those with forest management expertise in the Coast Range. And so our ultimate goal here is to have a research and management that is tailored to the landscape, not imposed on the landscape. And as I said, there was an analysis done with the research proposal based on a set of criteria and the data that we had available then. Now we're really digging into and refining this information based on some new data as well as additional criteria. And so another piece of this process is also forming a structure to make decisions under and strategies to address the integrated parts of forest management under the research platform. So that is the larger vision and context, and where we're going with that timeline that was shared. So in order to develop a refined treatment allocation and detailed management strategies in this plan in support of the research, we need to dig in further to what is happening on the ground. And so rather than going square by square through that timeline to start with, what we wanted to do is look at an example of how we're addressing this through the process. And so this is an example at the sub-watershed level. This is actually one of the watersheds that was highlighted by a member of the advisory committee as an area that needs further analysis. And we're applying the same process across all of the sub-watersheds. So you can see with this example, this is Anonymous Creek. It's a triad I, that's what it's been allocated to, 530 acres. It's a complex mixture of intensive, extensive, reserves, and riparian conservation areas. And so you can see a couple of things here. I'm gonna just move my zoom so I can fully see. So we have here a series of intensive in the light green. There we go. Extensive in the orange, the riparian conservation areas in blue, and reserves in this red color. And so what you'll notice here is that for the intensive, and this is according to the research proposal, we're planning for a 60-year rotation. These rotations, because the stands are starting at different ages, are obviously not all going to happen at the same time. And so you can see here stand 1655 at the top. With our current analysis, it's age 37. This would be planned for regeneration harvest in 2044. Here we have a stand that is 41 years old, and this would be 2040. Here you have an 11-year-old stand that's been assigned to intensive, and the planned regeneration harvest would be in 2069. So the takeaway here is that these management activities would be happening across this watershed on a very long time horizon based on the rotation and management strategies that are laid out in the management plan. There may be intermediate stand treatments such as thinning in both the intensive and extensive. And as I said, the timing of forest operations is staggered depending on the treatment allocation and the current stand age. And you can see here pointing out this orange extensive area right here. The plan is for 125 years for the first retention harvest, and this would be a low to medium retention harvest as it's planned right now in this area. For the extensive, the range is a 20 to 80% retention harvest.
Hey, Shannon, a quick question here.
Yeah.
So as I look at this, which is totally cool, I could play with this for days on end. Is this just an example or an actual? Because you have 3 stand 1864s in the same area. Is that the way it works? They're all in the same drainage. So, or am I reading something incorrectly here?
Nope, you're absolutely correct. That's a typo. So this is an actual sub watershed.
Okay.
Watershed 82, and each stand should have its own number. So we are using this as an example, but it is one of the watersheds on the Elliott.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, so this is the same stand, and now we're layering another set of data and criteria for analysis. And so you can see, in addition to our treatment allocations that we have here, there are some diagonal lines running this way for stand age greater than 65, and there are diagonal lines running the other way for marbled murrelet northern spotted owl designation. And that's both species together. It's not separated one or the other. And so this crosshatch area is where those two overlap. So one of the things we wanted to point out here is now that we're going into this process of refinement, some of the things that we are coming back to and looking at in all of these stands, and particularly in this stand, there's a couple of things that that we'll be looking at. So you can see stand 1866 here is inextensive, and this stand right here and the reserve area to the right are both 126 years old, and so they've both had harvesting in the past. In this first analysis, this area was assigned to extensive with an 80% retention because of its age. And now we're at the stage where we're looking at this area to determine if that initial allocation makes sense with additional criteria. So if this does remain inextensive, does this become part of the 500-acre 80% retention experience for marbled murrelet that was outlined in the research proposal? And that's part of this forest management plan, is to dig into that, that experiment. We can look at the stand boundaries. Do the stand boundaries make sense based on criteria such as topography, operations, where the roads are, the quality of the roads, stand structure, habitat characteristics? Should these boundaries be adjusted a little bit, or do they make sense? Should treatment allocations be moved a little bit, and what effect does that have at the watershed scale and at the landscape scale? Because if you remember, this is a triad I, and so we're aiming for overall the percentages around right in this table. It's okay if it's off by a couple of percentage points, but this is really the structure that we're aiming for. And so any changes that we make here will have an impact somewhere else. And that's where the landscape analysis piece of this comes in. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit.
Shannon?
Yes.
Again, I apologize for interrupting, but this is
No problem.
totally fascinating. For all of the watersheds and for every part of the Elliott that is not in the reserve, the larger reserve section, have you guys created this level of detail for the whole dang thing?
Yes, this was part of the analysis that went into the research proposal. And so OSU worked with Mason, Bruce, and Gerard, and some of our own researchers who did a lot of the modeling and mapping. So we have this first analysis for the entire forest, and now we're going back watershed by watershed and fine tuning it.
I don't even know what to say. That's pretty cool. I want this. I want this map. Okay, I want to be able to play around with this like this.
What is the likelihood?
Keith, there are 400 pages of maps like this, just so you know.
Well, Bob, I'll get lost, man. You'll see me in about 8 years. Okay.
What's the likelihood that you would remove this from extensive?
So that's difficult to say, I think, without looking at what is actually happening on the ground and what input or what impact that would have at the watershed and landscape scale. Because as I said, any changes that we make here, we need to look at what that does at the broader scale to the treatment allocation based on this triad design. So, so we would need to look at the factors like the ones that I just listed to see, does this make sense in extensive? Are there other areas that we might want to switch out? Or are there some boundaries that we might want to adjust? And without doing that analysis, it's hard to say what the chances would be right now.
I would just offer up that that these are the very areas that I think we need to go in. We've got permission. The HCP gives us permission to alter habitat, and if we're going to do experiments, I've been saying this for 3 years, we need to poke the system and see what happens. And I think this is the very area that we need to poke and see what happens to that habitat. I personally think we can make it better.
And I will say, you know, and I know I've said this before, but this piece is really fine scale tuning. It's not about making broad sweeping changes, because that analysis has already been done. But what we're doing now is bringing in this additional criteria, looking at places where we have incomplete data, where the reality on the ground might not match up with the data that we had to run this first analysis, as well as bringing in input like we've gotten so far on this watershed and having more opportunities for that. So I'm not anticipating that there would be significant changes to these allocations, more like tweaks just based on the information that we have available.
So Shannon, you've got both what you're describing is this 40-acre stand, 1866. You also have marble murrelet habitat down a little bit to the right that's in intensive as well. That's one of those potential anomaly stands that we've discussed a lot.
Yeah.
But you have a variety of murrelet habitat in there that in a worst case scenario potentially is not going to be part of the 500. I mean, that may not work out one way or another, which indicates to me you could have a fairly substantial amount of movement in this watershed, which is almost all crosshatched in the reserve. And I'm wondering how that would happen under those instances, because you talk about maybe movement of a few percentage points one way or the other, but there's a scenario here where it would be significantly more than that, that it doesn't make sense for Matt's work. It all turns out to be occupied and so on and so forth. I'd also note too that this watershed, looking back at my watershed matrix, is a relatively simple one. You're right. It was one of the ones we raised concern about specifically because of all the murrelet habitat that was potentially going to be impacted. But what this watershed doesn't have that a lot of the other high priority watersheds do have was a lot of concern around, say, scenic viewpoints or camping or trails or various different kinds of things that we haven't even really gotten to yet. And then I think about some other things like some of the other species of concern. I think about amphibians, for example, where over the ridge connections are really important that we haven't even considered at this point. So I just throw that all out there because what would happen if, for example, you found enough problems in this watershed that you had to make major alterations that got you above a few percentage points? How would you deal with that?
I think those are all really important points to bring up, Bob, and those are the types of details that we're going to be digging into here. And as I said in the beginning, we don't want to impose management on this landscape that doesn't fit. And so those are the types of important questions that we'll need to go back and look at and see, does the research design as it's been allocated right now fit, and what types of tweaks do we need to make, and how minor will they be? And if there are some areas where it does seem like we might need to make a little bit more of a change, looking at sort of the ripple effects of what that means to adjacent sub-watersheds and stands. So I think those are areas that we would really like to work through with people like yourself and with members of the various working groups that we're putting together, because we really want to make sure that conservation is a piece of this, that the research experiment is tailored to the landscape and we're not imposing something on this landscape that doesn't fit. And you pointed out this area right here that is right now, according to our data, designated as marble murrelet and northern spotted owl, but on our map, it's intensive. And one of the pieces that we've found in looking and analyzing is that in some cases, the data that this is based on is outdated. And so there might be an area that is designated as habitat that's actually had a recent harvest. And so we need to go back and look first at how accurate is our information, what's actually happening on the ground, and then have those conversations and make those types of decisions. Because if this is not, important marble murrelet, northern spotted owl, if it's not important wildlife habitat, then we need to adjust. And the other way around too, if there's habitat that's not included in this analysis, but that's out there and we just haven't captured that, we want to make sure we know that too, so we can protect it.
Okay, no, I appreciate the answer, Shannon. I guess what I want to keep flagging though is that my concern probably first and foremost is that in a watershed like this, it's going to be very hard to make major adjustments if in fact they're required. So I think that's part of the reason why we've been so urgently wanting to get to the FMP. I'm glad we're there. But this is kind of where, as you said, the rubber hits the road. And I look at a watershed like this and I don't see that much flexibility, especially around the reserves. So without making major percentage alterations. I also just note too, I think it'll be really interesting to find out whether some of these marble murrelet habitat areas that are extensively logged already really are, because if they are and they were designated marble murrelet habitat, those are places where the state clearly violated the Endangered Species Act under their take avoidance approach. It's going to be really interesting to tease out how many of these occupied sites were actually clear cut, knowing that there were marble murrelets in there. And that's another place where I think we need to keep in mind that just because they are extensive today, they were illegally harvested if in fact they were designated trimas.
Bob, before we go too hyperbolic, some of those
I wouldn't call it hyperbolic.
well, yeah, because I don't remember the initial age of that stand, but it could be 40 years or 30, 21. I don't know exactly. Shannon, you have it on your earlier slide, but whatever the age is of that stand, the harvesting could have been done 40 years ago. And the misclassification is occurring because some of these classifications are based on the Davis model or some other model, and they were not ground truths, or they were not truthed with more updated imagery. And that's one of the things our new LiDAR imagery will really buy us, is that information. But the age of that stand isn't like 10. Well, I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't know.
I think it
recall
is.
the age.
I think it is 41.
Yeah, okay, that was what I was thinking, but I want to make sure. But so that happened 40 years ago. And so I don't know if trimas were being identified 40 years ago. You're probably better at knowing that than I am. But I just want to make sure that it's clear that we're not trying to point a finger at ODF, breaking the laws and doing things. We're just trying to get to the information that's accurate. So we know the baseline and we know the place we're moving from is the right place. And so that's all. I just wanted to make sure that was clear and we weren't.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Katie.
I have a quick question about the marble murrelet and owl designations as well. Looks like, using that same example, the intensive watershed on the east side of the east side of the map here, it looks like there's a marble murrelet owl designation that splits that stand, and I'm just curious about that, because my understanding is usually those designations are made on a stand level, so I'm curious what I'm seeing there.
That's a good question, Colin. I'd have to go back and look at the mapping behind this to see what exactly is going on there. Katie, I'm not sure if you have a better idea right now.
Well, in some of this initial cut, we were doing it pretty much based on stand age and of the existing stand structure. And they didn't always overlap exactly with what was designated as habitat. So there's that mixture. And then there's the placement of some of these stands, such as the one that's divided, that's labeled 1866. I think that's the only one with that label. Yeah, the one that's labeled 1866. In our inventory, that's a single stand. And there was a approximately 40-acre piece carved out of it to assign it to extensive in our allocation to meet our percents, but it's not necessarily the best place for that to occur, both in terms of operations and in terms of habitat quality. And so that could easily be moved, up closer to the ridge where the road is. It could be, right now it was really just guessed by the mapping technician at the time, because we didn't have any other data other than that was a single stand of that age. But we only needed 40 acres, and so she just carved 40 acres out of it. It wasn't, there's nothing magical about that assignment of that area, those 40 acres. And that's where we have a lot of flexibility, to be honest, is where is that, where are the birds, what are the, the other issues such as connectivity, like you brought up, Bob, and fragmentation. Is there a better alignment that reduces fragmentation? And is there a better alignment that, reduces scenic impacts and or recreational impacts? But again, this is an integration, right? This isn't a one way or the other way. It's more of an integration to look for an optimal solution. And that's the stage that we're in now, is how to go about doing that, and when is it most needed by. And so.
And Katie, I think what I hear you saying, and Shannon as well, is in the word that you used, optimization, I think resonates for me. And it's not a renegotiation of commitments that were made on the research platform or redoing that. It's sort of saying, is there a logical reason and a practical way that you can make adjustments that would allow operations to happen more efficiently or protections to happen more effectively, but not trying to do a wholesale renegotiation of commitments that were made in the platform, but just retooling and optimizing based on additional information that's available now.
The thought that comes to my mind is that scientifically, wouldn't you be better with random placement? I mean, you are affecting the outcome of the experiment by choosing where you put it. I mean, you're optimizing habitat, you're trying to avoid this, you're trying to avoid that. Isn't that what you should be trying to avoid, is predetermining what the outcome is by your placement of your experiment?
Paul, I think that based on some forms of statistics, you're correct, 100% correct, that optimization would be ideal. However, these systems are not true replicates of each other's, and we have methodology, statistical methodology, to deal with the a priori, the prior management structure. And so you're right, if we could just take this landscape and randomly, assign 1 acre, 10 acre pixels, and then say, okay, pick, these percentages of each one of these pixels to make this experiment. Yeah, that's great. And that's a great benchtop experiment, but it doesn't recognize that this is a natural system and it already has pre-existing conditions. And so the pixels are not true replicates of each other in any regard. So we used a different type of analysis called the linear mixed model analysis, and to predict outcomes. And it's something that's done regularly in the ecological community, because we recognize that we're not at a lab benchtop, and some of the benchtop statistics don't work as well in this system as they would in a laboratory setting. So, but we do have ways of dealing with that. And we've consulted a lot with a statistician on this point, particularly. And there's a chapter addressed on that, has to do with the power analysis chapter that's in the proposal. So we've also responded to this critique in a couple of our responses to some of the reviews that we solicited to. So it's a really good point, and it's one I think we have covered. But and the other part of this is part of the experiment is the public input and the integration, right? It's not, I mean, that's the ultimate ivory tower, is that we just pretend we can come in here and just, impose a treatment with not paying attention to public input. And so the real experiment is, can we successfully integrate, and what that looks like, and then test that over time using these 4 different methods. So.
Thanks, Katie, for the response, and Paul for the question. I'm wondering, Shannon, if maybe we want to let you get through a little bit more of your presentation, and then we continue to have questions and responses as we go, but we also have a lot of time for discussion at the end. I wonder whether we want to let you get going here on the presentation a little bit more.
Sure. So then the next piece is just sort of walking through that process that's outlined in the timeline about how we would go about tackling some of these optimization questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So as I said, to answer these questions, we need to apply a process for updated data collection, modeling, landscape analysis, and adaptive management at the stand level and at the watershed level, and taking into account the landscape level view that making a change in one of these areas may impact another, as we've already discussed. And so understanding the full projected outcome of management decisions at the sub-watershed and the landscape scale, based on the research design and the management at the stand level, and looking at where can we put treatments with the least amount of disturbance to maximize, as we've discussed, the protection measures, the research and experimental design, and the other values that we have for this forest. And so we just wanted to do an overview of a couple of these different threads that are in the timeline. One is data collection and analysis. So this includes a couple of different things. Gathering existing data sets, including digitizing maps of stand management sales, which we have recently completed. We have 75 of the 175 sale maps, and those are all now digitized. This lidar that was flown in the summer of 2021, and there's a snapshot here. This is from a presentation that Deanne gave to the advisory committee back in November, just looking at some of the preliminary images coming out of that. But I think right now we're expecting to have this information on that 2021 LiDAR in February. And so at that point, we can dig into the updated data analysis, which will be important for accurate age of stands, identifying older trees and older stands, and using accurate and current data in the modeling and treatment allocations.
Hey, Shannon, can I ask a question about that LiDAR image?
Yes.
I'm assuming that so there's basically a darker, a very lighter, and then something in the middle, and that represents different ages of stands. Is that right?
This is the let's see, this one, right, this LiDAR image right here is the bare earth model. So that's looking at topography.
Okay, so all right, thanks.
Yeah, and then this is just an aerial image, looking down at the landscape, and we're going to be getting more detailed information and be able to look at those tree heights with the full LiDAR data. So in addition to the data that we already have, we're looking at additional data needs, and that includes things like accurate data on tree age, tree density, structural characteristics for habitat, and we can talk a little bit more about that as well. We are planning in the summer of 2022 to have some field work going, collecting some of this information and targeting which areas of the forest we want to go into this summer. Obviously, we cannot cover the entire forest in one summer with field crews, but really prioritizing where the important information is that we need to make sure we have an updated picture of what's going on. And so that might include some stand inventories, bird surveys, using tools like ground-based LiDAR, which Bogdan Strimbu talked about when he met with the advisory committee back in November. And so this is another piece that we're working on as part of the timeline. Another piece is looking at the equipment to launch the research monitoring, and that would also start to happen this year. So another piece in the timeline is modeling. And this means running simulations to best inform the landscape and forest land planning in an uncertain future. And we've discussed a couple of different model options. One that we are using is a landscape model called Landis-2, and Melissa Lukash and Neil Williams also came last month to present sort of an overview of that model and how it can be applied and how it is applied. And so these models are being used to power the landscape analysis of the Elliott and this look at optimization of treatments. And so we are with Landis looking at the data inputs. We'll be looking at the model behavior. So not just looking at the outputs, but what answers is the model giving us and why? Are we getting the right answers for the right reasons? What additional data needs do we need to further parameterize the model and continue to refine that model for the Elliott? During the ESRF research proposal development, the ESRF 2015 stand level inventory data was used to run a program called FES, which predicts the rate of forest growth in response to harvest. And so in addition to some of these landscape models, we are also looking at using FVS and Woodstock to look at those forest growth rates. FVS is a model that relies on the past to predict the future. And so as climate shift and we enter an uncertain future, we're looking at augmenting our approach and using a variety of different models. And as Melissa and Neil discussed, one of the benefits of a landscape model like Landis 2 is that it's able to predict forest growth using different climate scenarios. And so we're looking at the full suite of models, including others, looking at species habitat, hydrology, that we can use to get a clearer picture of what's happening on the Elliott, and that would contribute long-term to the research going on in the forest as well. But as I said, these models and that analysis will really inform that overall landscape analysis and allow us to test some of the potential outcomes of our various treatment allocations and management scenarios. And so another piece from our timeline is this landscape analysis, optimizing placement of treatments and informing the management strategies using those models. And so optimal placement and design of those allocations would be according to multiple criteria, as we've already discussed. There are some listed here, and we've included others already in our conversation today, but that might include things like stand age, topography, the road network, looking at road quality and access, where can we do the management that we intend to do without building new roads, riparian areas, protection of fish-bearing and non-fish-bearing streams, looking at habitat structure and quality, and avoiding fragmentation to the best of our ability at a watershed and landscape scale. And so with this process, we're using models to help run this landscape analysis, and then analyzing that model behavior and ground truthing, and bringing in input from people on the ground, as well as people who have additional information, so that we're really considering a full suite of criteria when we're doing this analysis step. I mentioned some of the key research projects that were outlined in the research proposal. And this is another piece of that timeline that's in that Excel sheet. And so this is just an outline of the key research projects that we're working on at this part of the management plan development. The research proposal states that we will conduct a large-scale experiment on restoration thinning in the dense Douglas fir plantations that are now assigned to reserves. And so we're working on that plan that specifies the types of thinning, where they will occur, where they will occur, and how that fits within an experimental design context. Another of the research projects that was highlighted is designing a strategy for adaptive silviculture for climate change. And part of this is connecting with the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project, which is a collaborative effort to establish a series of experimental silvicultural trials across a network of different forest ecosystems throughout the United States. And currently there is a gap in our area in the Northwest. And so we're looking at how do we integrate with that project and design our strategy for adaptive silviculture. The third one you see here is riparian reserve layout and restoration treatments in both the MRW and CRW. I mentioned this one before, but outlining the study of 500 acres, 80% retention for marbled murrelet. And then the final one highlighted here is really digging into the silvicultural approaches for extensive treatments and outlining what that would entail. And so right now we've been talking with a lot of different people. We're putting together working groups around various pieces of this plan, including these key research projects. And so we're going to be continuing with collaborative efforts with a broad range of people with different areas of expertise to really integrate all of that as we look at our management strategies and set up these key research projects. Another piece of this is looking at the adaptive management strategy. And this slide kind of takes that adaptive management strategy concept and applies it to this example of allocation. So, what we're doing is conducting the data collection and collation that I talked about, modeling, and this in-depth landscape analysis, identifying criteria for treatment allocation, allocating treatments within these sub-watersheds. And I should mention, again, this is not creating new allocations. This is looking at that initial analysis that was done on the research proposal, because everything that we're doing in this forest management plan process is based on that research proposal. But looking at those allocations and our additional criteria and input and seeing where we might need to make some tweaks to optimize. Looking at adaptive management triggers, developing a list of criteria, outcomes for how we view adaptive management and our decision-making process, reanalyze the landscape based on those decisions at the watershed scale, review with input from stakeholders, partners, advisory committees, working groups, and then feed that back into our landscape analysis. And so you can see this is an iterative process and a pretty complex one too. And this is sort of the key piece of what's highlighted in that timeline. And then going alongside all of this is the development of the various forest management strategies. And we have a lot of information to pull on from the research proposal, from the HCP, from information we already have about the Elliott, but also incorporating this new FMP development process, all of the new information and the analysis that we're doing. And so this also, of course, includes continued conversations and input from our working groups, various committees, tribes, and individuals. And so you'll also see the development of these various pieces of the forest management strategy in that timeline and table of contents as well. So I know that was a lot of information I threw at you. Hopefully having an example to kind of work through is helpful in trying to apply that, that timeline in that Excel spreadsheet. What we'd really like to do, in addition to any other questions that this working group would like to discuss, is have a conversation with you about what key sections of the FMP you feel are important from your perspective for this December 2022 draft. As we've discussed, we have December 2022 as a major milestone for getting some the key sections of this draft ready to present, and there will be additional analysis and refinement work in 2023 based on our 2-year timeline. And so what we're looking at right now is getting this working group's feedback on what that key information is that you feel it's necessary for us to make sure that we do our best to include in that, that December 2022 draft. And then we can also talk about the process of what does it take to get there, given the steps that I just went through.
Shannon, one point of clarification. When you talk about a December 2022 draft, we've been talking about trying to get it before the land board at December 2022. So, I mean, are we really talking about a October or November draft, because it's going to need to obviously be in some sort of final presentation form earlier than that. I just want to make sure that we're really on the same timeline here.
Yes, thank you, Bob. That's a great clarification. And in the timeline, it does have the draft being finalized by November and the presentation in December.
Great, thank you.
Ken.
You have the microphone turned off. Looking at the outline of the draft here, this goes to Shannon, I think, in particular, but rather than say anything about what it appears to me we need to have in this draft, what I see is missing, including missing here in the list of other items to be developed, is anything about recreation. We've mentioned, Katie used the word in some of her responses. Bob in some of his comments earlier both spoke a little about recreation. Now, perhaps I was missing in the early parts of this outline development and didn't see it, but recreation is going to be something that's overlaid across this entire landscape, and that may be traditional recreation, like I represent, kind of the hunting community, if you will. And fishers to the same to some extent, but I see this as something that's just frankly missing in this outline completely at this point in time. So, response?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, and you're absolutely right. Recreation and public access are a key piece of this. And in the research proposal, I believe we discuss the importance of having a recreation plan as well as an educational plan. And so that is a key part of that process. Whether the full recreation plan would be outlined separately from the FNP, but also integrated and incorporated with the FNP. I think the recreation and access need to be included in there within the overall confines or underneath the research mission and the habitat conservation goals. And so what we're looking at right now is looking at that research platform, kind of detailing that out, looking at the HCP, looking at the recreation that is already on the forest, and then what are the possibilities for the future. And a part of that will be, I think, this FNP engagement process, which we'll talk about more in December on the 15th. But a piece of that we're planning is having a series of hybrid meetings that are based locally around the Elliott, but are also accessible, broadly throughout the state, to have input from people on what they would like to see recreation and access wise. All of that needs to be nested under the research management and habitat conservation goals of the forest. So I guess I would say I agree with you. I think it's a key value for the forest. It's outlined in the research proposal, and it's just a question of how and when in this development process we address it. But calling it out more explicitly in the forest management plan is something that we can look into.
And Shannon, I think it's such an obvious question that if we don't at least address it in the list of things to be developed, and I totally agree with your assessment that in the overall research plan and the overall framework here, we've certainly talked a lot about recreation, but it's such an obvious question that if we don't at least have something there that can point people to where they go to find more information about what we may or may not do recreation wise, it's going to be a bit of a time sink just answering my question over and over and over amongst the public. So thank you much.
I agree. Yeah. And so this table of contents, it's a draft that's had input in the past, so can continue to have input in the future. And as we bring in additional information, I'm anticipating that we will continue to see points like this come up where we understand that it's important to kind of add a section or make it clear about what information is included where. And so thank you for that feedback. And it's something that we'll definitely look at.
I agree with those thoughts on recreation, and I would encourage you to not delay public outreach on recreation and other cultural uses of the forest. I also think that recreation and cultural use of the forest needs to play a pretty prominent role in the forest management plan and not be buried in an attachment somewhere. I think the risk that we run, there's been so much focus on the allocations and the management prescriptions. I think the risk is that recreation and cultural use of the forest will be perceived as an afterthought. And I think it'd be good to get ahead of that.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Colin,
Colin.
and thanks for the feedback. And as a reminder, I'm gonna try to get a queue going here. And I think Mark, are you on the recreation topic?
No, I'm on the table of contents, but not recreation.
Okay, so I'm gonna go Paul, and then Bob Salinger, and then Mark. And Diana, I see you want to get in. For members of the public, as a reminder, if you joined late, we're going to reserve conversation during the meeting and discussion for advisory committee members. And then we will have time for public comment at the end, towards the end of the meeting. So I'll make sure to have you on the queue for that. With that said, Paul Beck.
Actually, I think Bob was up ahead of me. So
Go ahead, Paul, it's fine.
Okay. The one thing, and it was the very first, one of the very first slides you showed that was the timeline of the different processes that you're going to be going through. And unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to look at that prior to this meeting. But you had the economics starting second to last. And my concern is every one of these research projects that I've seen on the Forest Service, on the BLM, has failed because the money wasn't there. If you design this without the money in mind, this will fail. So the quicker that you can get the economics integrated into what it is that you want to do, what it is you can actually afford to do would be maybe be a better way of saying it. I think you need to push that forward to make sure that this doesn't fail for lack of money.
And I'm on mute. Appreciate that comment, Paul. We actually have a financial analysis that was done as part of the research proposal. And on the 15th, we're going to be presenting that budget analysis, which includes a startup as well as continued annual forest operations and the projections that we have. So I think you're absolutely right. The way that it's laid out in this timeline, it's not that we would be starting from scratch with a revenue strategy and a financial analysis. One was done as part of the research proposal. And the placement of it on that timeline, I think, is meant to convey that all of these efforts to update the analysis and the treatment allocation, those new numbers would be going into the financial analysis to update that. And it's not necessarily that we would start updating the financial analysis at that point. It's just that that's maybe when we expect to have more of that current information to be able to do that update. But I definitely understand your concern on that.
That's helpful clarification. Great question, Paul. And I would also note, Paul, it may be helpful if you have particular elements. I know Eric raised this as well during our last meeting, full advisory committee meeting, that would be helpful to see in the presentation and the conversation at the upcoming full advisory committee related to financial analysis. It maybe, you can connect with Shannon and Katie and the team and share that ahead of time so we make sure we get those things addressed.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Paul. Bob, and then Ken.
Thanks. I think our priorities were really well articulated in terms of the timeline by the letter that was pulled together by Mark. And Mark, thanks for doing that. So you have kind of a list from us. The thing I would probably highlight first and foremost is just, and we can get this to you next week. we had a list back, whatever it was, a year, 2 years ago, of watersheds we saw the most opportunity for potential challenges. There's about 12 of them. Some of them got moved around after that, so maybe slightly less. But I would prioritize those. I think of there's just a few that or percentage that seem to have the most opportunity for challenge that we want to look at early, if we're, as I was alluding to earlier, maybe the biggest alterations would have to be made where you're getting above a few percentage points potentially. So I think knowing those early would be really helpful. And I'll try to pull that together by midweek next week. We have a meeting early next week among ourselves, so we can probably get that list finalized into you midweek next week. The other thing I think is interesting, just going back, this isn't a timeline thing, but to that map slide that you put up, is we do tend to focus a lot on where the reserves areas are, but I think one of the really interesting questions is actually where the extensive is. When you look at the slide that you put up, for example, you have intensive right next to all the Merlet habitat, and then extensive further away. Part of that's based on age, but it also is what leads to a lot of the fragmentation. So I think some of those questions are really interesting to think about in terms of optimizing the landscape. It's not just where the reserves are, it's where the extensive is in terms of buffering as well. So I think that those are some interesting questions to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that last point that you raised is definitely one of the questions that we're looking into. And I would love to reconnect with you next week. We do have that list of the watersheds that you sent, and we're continuing to dig into that. And so I'd really like to have a conversation with you and the rest of the OSU team and anyone else about those watersheds and address those concerns early on.
Okay, that'd be great. Well, let me circle back with folks and reconfirm on those, because we may be able to clean that up a little bit for you before that meeting, but that'd be great.
Great.
Thank you.
Sorry, so I'm gonna go Mark, then Ken, because Mark was actually, sorry, Ken.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks, Shannon, for the information. I guess just sort of following up maybe on some of Ken's comments and Colin relative to the table of contents, since that was brought up. And, we've looked at the table of contents before, and I think it has a lot of appropriate headings there, but what's hard to know is sort of what's within the headings. And, at some point, it'd be really helpful to have an annotated outline of what's going to be in there. And for example, one of the things that seems sort of missing to me, and you brought it to the forefront today in your presentation, but it's not really clear where the triad experimental framework is going to be presented and discussed, because it seems that's the organizing framework for the entire research forest and the forest management plan. But if you look at the table of contents, it doesn't really jump out where it is. There's a section under background that talks about sort of what's going to go on. But so I guess just an observation that it doesn't seem to, as we look at the OSU proposal, which calls that out almost immediately, at least the table of contents as it's presented here, that seems like it's not there, or at least I'm not sure where it is. And then sort of on a different topic, one I'd like to see expanded is there is a section on climate adaptation, which I think is appropriate. I think it'd also be good to have a section or include in that, expand that section to include natural climate solutions. And how is the Elliott Forest really thinking about the governor's executive order to the 19 state agencies to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon? And I think, somewhere in that forest management plan in this day and age, you'd want to have a section that at least addresses that and acknowledges what does that mean to OSU and the forest going forward. So those are a few thoughts on the table of contents. Maybe I'll just pause there for a moment.
Yes, I would just say I appreciate that feedback, Mark, and I think those are areas that we can definitely look into, and making it clearer in our table of contents as we get more into the details of drafting what information is going to be where, and making sure that it's accessible by looking at that outline. And on the natural climate solutions, that's a piece that we can definitely look into as well.
And then I guess kind of going back to the watershed analysis and sort of the landscape analysis that you're pulling together there, have you begun to prioritize, or will you prioritize watersheds that you're going to go deep into now? Is it, as you sort of think about what would be approached in the first 5 or 10 years, it seems like the forest management plan would have to pretty quickly figure out where are those watersheds where you're actually going to begin to take action on the ground. And I'm just wondering, because you can't do, the 100+ watershed analysis to that depth all at once right now. So somewhere you've got to sort of carve off, here's what we think we're going to do in the next 5 or 10 years. And so I guess I wonder what your thoughts are on that at this point.
Mark, can I ask you to clarify when you say what you're going to do? Are you speaking to research projects, specific research projects, or are you speaking to sort of active management in particular sub-watersheds?
Well, I think I'm thinking about active management and what are you going to need to know in order to do that? And it seems like the landscape analysis is informing that to some extent. And as you get more information on stand age and can sort of reconfigure how it makes sense on the ground, but you can't do that sort of everywhere all at once. So at some point you've got to carve out, the first tier of watersheds where you think you can take action in the first 5 years rather than the other, the majority of the watersheds that, if you're going to do extensive in 2103, that one doesn't really need to quite be figured out yet. But if you're looking at intensive and you've got some stands that are, already 50 to 60 years old, how do you transition that and when? So I guess that's in sort of to respond to your question, Peter. Some of these are going to be areas where action occurs sooner rather than later. And so as you do these analyses now, at what point do you begin to identify, here's the 15 watersheds where we think something's going to happen and we've got to dig. That's where we're going to do our work in the summer of 22.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And I think you hit the nail on the head. So the active management is what's being used to implement this triad experimental design, this research platform. And as you said, we can't start everywhere at once, nor do we want to. And so part of that landscape analysis is targeting those areas. And in the research proposal, we outlined that we would identify 16 watersheds for replicates of each of the 4 treatments, and that those would be areas that we would focus on first and then apply the adaptive management strategy that's being outlined in this forest management plan to then look beyond those initial 16 watersheds. So that's a big part of the analysis and the management strategy that we're working on at this stage.
Great, thank you. That's a helpful clarification.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Shannon. Ken and then Colin.
Well, I'm trying to wrap my own head around my question here, Shannon, but and I would kind of echo what Mark said, because I've looked at the outline and I don't see where my particular question here fits. But the question is, amongst the various types of habitats that we have on the landscape, one of my focuses has always been the complex early xeral vegetation. And I see, I'm like Keith, I see these maps and I start thinking about where that particular element, which is a very, very small element of the Coast Range landscape, 2 to 5% in early xeral. I just wanted, like Keith, spend 8 years looking at all the possibilities for how that type of a habitat is distributed across the landscape. And so I think probably in section 3 is where something along this line needs to go. But within that habitat type, we've got kind of 3 major things that a lot of folks talk about: pollinators, either neotropical birds or songbirds, and Bob would be the best one to tell me what terminology I should use for those species of birds that continually use what I've seen in my career with Forest Service as the clear cuts. But they're also very prevalent in any landscape that has those elements of early xeral forage. And then of course there's the large ungulates, large mammals that use those same landscapes. And mixed in with that is a recreation element, and is also a roads and access element in terms of what level of road access we can have on those, and and not have excessive disturbance to those large mammals, or more particularly in the hunter's case, the the large ungulates across the landscape. So that's kind of what I'm trying to formulate for a question is, how do we assure the public that there is some attention paid across this landscape to how we can distribute that early cereal forage element and that habitat type across the landscape over time. The 60-year rotation on the intensive management automatically does that at some level. And again, I think that's kind of where Keith's brain was going, was how do you track these habitat types, whatever they might be, including the totally reserve area. There's certainly an element in the early treatments of the previously clear-cut intensive management pieces, and you just spoke about it a couple of minutes ago, Shannon, about how we look at treatments, early treatments in those previous clear-cut dense conifer plantations across time, within the time element that we can try to direct those more specifically toward an older habitat type within the reserve areas. So that's, I just want to see that that's called out there somewhere, that there's a discussion of the less primary habitat types, if you will, and their spatial and temporal distribution across this landscape over time. I'll be quiet now.
That's a great question. And so I think what I'm hearing is that in the table of contents, as we continue to develop out this draft, just being really clear about what information is included and where to find it. And that's not clear necessarily for all of these types of questions right now in the draft that we have. And this is a high level draft table of contents right now. I think to your other question, that is a really important point, that we are digging into those details in this management plan and as part of the research. And I think one of the major ways that we're trying to make sure that those questions are part of this process is by bringing together multiple science working groups that are made up of researchers from different areas of expertise. And so in the example of the intensive, we might have landscape ecologists, silviculturalists, and then some people who look at animal behavior. For example, Jim Rivers, I was actually just talking with him earlier this week about some of the very same things you brought up about his excitement to do research on pollinators, early cereal songbirds, amphibians. And so the fact that I think we're able to bring those types of people together into a room, whether it's actually in a physical room or in a room like this, and have those conversations and make sure that that's part of the management and the research. I'm hoping that we will be able to address these types of questions that you're bringing up. That's our goal.
Yeah, and it certainly was, a much finer level of detail that I was alluding to here than what we have in a high level outline. One other comment, I said I'd be quiet, but I do need to toss one other one in, is in that section to be developed at the top of the list on roads, I would really like to see some wording there that gives people the understanding that there will be a robust look at which roads are needed, not needed, where we could decommission, those kinds of potentials, at least kind of explain a process that may exist or should exist, I think, to have a robust look at the roads and the access needs across this landscape. And even though, and I've said this before, even though the 80 to 90,000 acre block that we have here sounds great and large from a research perspective, from a larger landscape perspective about what goes on around that forest, it's a pretty small postage stamp in the Coast Range compared to the rest of the landscape there. And I speak specifically about what's been done with roads on the National Forest to the north. And, you're looking at the guy that spent his last 10 years doing that kinds of roads analysis on the Sayusla National Forest. And also what you see in the private industrial and even in the BLM lands, industrial more or less to the south and the BLM lands to to the west, Siuslaw to the north. Just a good key there so people know that there will be a good hard look at that road system. So thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think the example of roads is a key part of where the management plan will really dig into that decision-making process. It was mentioned in the research proposal, just sort of a general approach to existing roads and any potential new roads and just sort of limiting the impacts. And so this is really where we would detail out what the sideboards are, what the policies are, and what the decision-making process would be.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Shannon. Colin.
So I just wanted to follow up on what Ken just said, and then I had a separate question. I think some of the information that Ken's interested in, access, roads, trails, as well as that early successional habitat type, how it's distributed on the landscape and how it's available over time, is also going to be very interesting to the tribes. We'll be very interested in that information. I think that would be best covered in a cultural and recreational use section of the forest management plan. And I see that as being a pretty important component of the forest management plan. And then I also just wanted to get your thoughts. I'm curious, what are you envisioning as far as the lifespan of this FMP? Are you envisioning that there will be it'll be in effect for a set period of time, and then there will be a major revision? Will there be smaller iterative revisions that are that follow from the adaptive management process? And then also along those same lines, how much specificity will be in the forest management plan in terms of harvest schedules and prescriptions and mitigation measures?
Great questions. Thank you, Colin. I guess I'll start with the last one first. So in previous conversations, I think there was a slide that kind of laid out a couple of different blocks and headings, and one was looking at this higher level initial step of looking at the research proposal and the HCP. Under that was the FMP, which is sort of the more of the implementation stage, the decision-making stage, the strategy stage of how do we implement the research proposal and the HCP on the ground. And then there's another step under that that's really looking at the operational tactical stage. And so I think, to answer your question, that level of detail on specific forest operations and prescriptions, that would come in that last operational stage, not necessarily at this FMP stage. And Katie and Tom, if you have other comments on that as well, please weigh in. As far as the timeline for this forest management plan, you know, we are in a fairly unique position in that this is not just a forest that we're managing for specific values, we're managing it for research. And so there's a lot of information that's going to be coming in with this experimental design, with the monitoring that we've been talking about in the first few years and then continuing after that. And so I think that's part of that adaptive management strategy of starting with the management of specific areas of the forest, having these strategies in place in the management plan, and then using that adaptive management strategy as well as any incoming information and analysis to continue to update our approach. And so I don't know if I can say how long this plan would be the, you know, it would be there without any revisions, but revisions and new additions and new documents are obviously a part of that. But this is also meant to be one of the foundational documents for the research forest and outline those strategies at a higher level. So I would definitely envision that there are forest management plans in the future, and maybe the not too distant future, that would rely on this adaptive management piece, the incoming information through the research program, but that this initial forest management plan would still continue to serve as a foundation, just with revisions, as with any forest management plan.
And one of the other elements, a related piece of this is something that's been discussed in sort of the governance context, is biennial operations plans, which would describe sort of on a near-term basis what would be happening on the ground, and that those would be based on the content of the FMP.
Yes, absolutely.
Other questions, comments, suggestions from the group?
Yeah, just a question, sort of a clarification, I guess. You mentioned one of the things was designing the restoration experiments for the plantations within the reserve area. So as you think about, maybe help me understand a little bit, in the FMP, how will that be discussed, to what level of detail versus what would be in an operations plan? Like in the FMP, would you say within the, and I don't, within the first 5 or 10 years, we anticipate doing into these watersheds, these plantations within the reserves to do what and when, or would it just sort of be flagged at some point? I'm sort of fumbling the question, but I think, I'm trying to find a distinction between what would be described in the FMP versus subsequently in the operations plan for something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that partially we would be able to have more of an answer once we actually get into those conversations with the working groups that are looking at that experiment. But as we're envisioning it, this FMP would detail the strategies and types of practices that would be used, not necessarily the schedule for what would happen when. That would come in that sort of operational tactical plan. That's how I'm viewing it right now. Katie, I'm not sure if you have any other detail to add, but again, we're going to be digging into that, that experimental design and talking with people who have a broad range of knowledge on various facets of that. And that'll help determine, I think, the level of detail and sort of the outline of how that experiment is set up.
And so would that be then similar for one of the areas you identified as silviculture and extensive? And we've had some conversation about this in the past, and examples of what is extensive, what does that mean? Do you see that being fleshed out more than we've talked about it to date, or where does that?
Yes, absolutely. And that is a key piece of this forest management plan, is looking at what are the suite of practices and prescription types and the goals of extensive, and looking at that range of 20 to 80% retention, what we would do to get there, not necessarily saying this is what we're going to do in this stand at this time. Again, that comes at a later point. But in the FMP, we are putting together a group that is really digging into that question. The research proposal looked at the overarching goals and objectives for extensive, but this is really where we dig into what that means.
Okay, thanks.
Others, any remaining questions, comments?
One quick comment. Mark just hit upon something that I really didn't mention when I was speaking in terms of this early soil component across the landscape. Is there's certainly a ton of opportunity to create some of that type of habitat within the extensive treatments. And I think, especially when you're looking at the kind of the range of retention that you just mentioned, Shannon, is 20 to 80%. There's certainly by default, some of that type of habitat is going to happen depending upon the retention level. And certainly also, back to the reserve area, there's some opportunities maybe to create some gaps in those younger plantation type stands as another way to get at that very underrepresented habitat type across the landscape.
Thanks, Ken. We've got a few minutes here, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 minutes before we're going to go to public comment. I want to revisit the question that was on the agenda. This has all been really helpful feedback, suggestions, etc. I want to revisit the question that Shannon posed, at the outset of this, related to the December of 2022 timeline, and knowing that there is work that will extend beyond that, but it's also a key moment when a presentation is going to be made and document brought before the land board. And I want to see if, in light of what you've heard, are there elements that are of particular interest to members of this advisory committee that they want to ensure are presented at a particular development point during that 2022 presentation, and in that draft document that you want to speak to now? Any reactions to that or thoughts? Mark, and then Ken.
Well, I thought, Shannon, you gave a pretty good synopsis of it in one of your last slides there, where you listed 5 things, and I don't know if I'll get them quite right, but one was the restoration experiments for plantations in the reserve. Sort of, what does that look like? What are the strategies and the range of practices or treatments that you apply there? Same in riparian thinning, which I think was described as creating openings. What does that look like? To what extent? There's the marbled murrelet 500-acre research design study. I think that one needs to be fully fleshed out. And then the silviculture and extensive. What does that mean, and what does that look like on the landscape? And I guess the other piece of that maybe is a subset, especially in these 16 watersheds that you're carving out for the first block of activity.
Thanks, Mark. Ken?
I think it's probably important, particularly when we get to that 2022 end of the year piece. I think it's really important in my mind to kind of go back to some of the basics, and the one I would call out is kind of the placement of any further development. I know there's been a lot of talk about Coos Bay area there, and I've forgotten the name of the facility, but about the idea of having a headquarters for the forest there, about the idea early on in a lot of our conversations about economic development as a spinoff of some of the work that's done on the forest, whether that be the jobs in the woods, jobs in mills, or recreation kinds of related development. I think it's important that we, at the very minimum, just kind of call out that probably in some of those introductory subsections there, Shannon, that there is and has been an emphasis on trying to support the local communities with the work that's done across the Elliott. And that's, obviously the Reedsport Coos Bay country, and ties directly to the Willamette Valley and more of the population kind of via the links into the Eugene area, if you will, and even links down to Medford, and of course as far up as the urban population from, I'm in Corvallis, and so from Eugene north on I-5 is going to be very interested in this piece of real estate.
Can you lean just a little closer to your microphone? Just you're fading out just a little bit there at the end.
Talk about economics, Shannon. Local economics.
Thanks, Ken.
Unless somebody's in the queue, I'll jump in here. Peter, is that all right? Shannon, I'm going to echo a little bit about what Ken has said, and I've thought more about it since he started talking about Earl's sterile habitat, and that, as he can tell you, and I can, the bulk of the recreational use of the Elliott for the last decades has been people like Ken and I chasing animals around up there. And while there are people who use the roads, there's some camping element, but principally, the bulk of that is people who are chasing deer and elk on the Elliott, and without, I mean, so there's a historical value in that sense, at least over the last, what, 6 decades, something like that, 7 decades, and without that appropriate habitat, which is beginning to disappear now, we're going to, I mean, that's going to be lost. And I think that in terms of addressing recreation, that makes great sense, because I think it was Melissa who mentioned this maybe in the last governance meeting we had, that the recreational component to people on the coast and the people in the area, Reedsport to Coos Bay, Elkton to Roseburg to Coos Bay, is going to be important, as well as the economic stuff that Ken just came back to. So as I think about it more and more, I think that's something that's worthy of at least highlighting at some point. And especially with, you know, the fact that 40% or a significant part of the Elliott is never under the conservation area, is not going to see that habitat return. And so in the other remaining part, I think Ken's onto something here, in that somewhere that needs to be highlighted in some manner. I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to echo what Ken has kind of begun to say, and I think he's dead on in that, in some regard.
And Ken's going to jump back in for a second, and I'm guessing that Colin's going to say this in a moment or two. You know, that element of the kind of the hunter-gatherer type of, you know, we call it recreation these days. The folks that were here way before us for who knows how long, centuries, decades, whatever kind of terminology you want to use, but the prehistoric uses of the forest have changed over time, given how much of that type of habitat exists. You know, right after some of the major Coast Range fires, you've just got a massive habitat of early cereal that you know, doesn't exist at this point in time, but it's been used time immemorial. So, thanks.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Keith. Colin?
Yeah, you read my mind, Ken. I was just going to chime in and say that chasing deer and elk around the Elliott has been one, if not the primary uses of the Elliott for at least a few thousand years, and probably since there was Douglas fir forests on the Elliott, and that's what it's been managed for. So I just wanted to add that.
Colin, I'd like to thank you for not pointing out that I've been up there for not quite a few thousand years too. So
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Keith. Any other items for raising today? Great.
I was under the impression that when Jedediah Smith came through, Keith was standing there pointing out where the elk were.
Thanks for adding that. Yeah, Bob.
I think just a concern that we really have to stick to this timeline. You know, I mean, if it slips at all, we miss this land board. We've slipped a lot, as you know, we all know, and you know, I think it's going to be rigorously adhered to. So I think as we get more depth on it, I mean, I think we really need a very, very, very clear timeline that, and there simply can be no slippage at this point. And we backed ourselves up against the wall as badly as we could. In fact, we went beyond the wall already, from my perspective. So I just want to flag that, because you know, we have a long history on this of just delay. Maybe we're finally there, but if we're not, then we're going to start to miss our deadlines, and we don't have a backup plan at this point.
Thanks, Bob. Paul, Beck.
I would offer up that I agree with Bob that we need to stick to this timeline, but we don't want perfection to interfere with good. I mean, I feel that there is an effort to make this absolutely perfect before we roll it out, and I think I think we need to make it good, and we need to make it flexible to where we can make it perfect somewhere down the road. But if we're going to make this timeline, good is good enough.
Thanks, Paul. Colin.
Along those same lines, I think it's important to stick to the timeline. And it's even as ambitious as it is. One thing I noticed in looking at the timeline is we have months and months of data gathering, and it's, for me, having experience writing forest management plans, you never have perfect information on the landscape you're trying to work with. I would caution against trying to achieve that perfection, get perfect information on the landscape before we write the forest management plan. I think a lot of that can be written into the forest management plan, the need for continually updating and improving the data. But I wouldn't wait to try to get that perfect information before we actually write the plan.
Thanks, Colin. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I guess I was going to say the same thing with a slightly different perspective, in that, at least in the past, this has been talked about as potentially a 10-year forest management plan, but I think it's really likely there'll be, if that's sort of an approximate time frame, a need to make some amendments within the first 10 years, particularly as we're at the beginning here, and there's going to be an influx of information coming in the first 5 years. So to that extent, there may be revisions in the forest management plan in year 5 or 6, which sort of goes back to the point Colin, you and Paul were making, that, we've got to roll with the information we have, recognizing we'll get more, and there'll probably be adjustments as that occurs.
Shannon, go ahead, Colin, and then Shannon, I'll see if you have any reactions or responses to that.
Yeah, one more point to add on. No matter how good this forest management plan is, it's going to be outdated the second it goes into effect. So, and it's going to need to be revised the second it goes into effect. So that's one thing that's also important, is writing a plan that allows for those revisions to take place, not painting yourself into a box so that you're stuck with an outdated plan the second you try to implement it.
Thanks, Colin. Go ahead, Shannon, and maybe you can touch on both elements of that, sort of the adaptability, flexibility of the FMP, and how you might be thinking about that, as well as working with available information, integrating information as it becomes available, but also sort of what's good enough to allow you to proceed as expeditiously as possible.
Yeah, well, thank you for all those comments. And, I think we're all in agreement that this management plan is not going to be a rigid document that's going to, to direct the management of this research forest for, years and decades to come. Really, what it's meant to be is a guiding document that outlines the strategies, the foundation for the research forest, and the decision-making processes, to Colin's point, that as more information comes in, that we're able to react and adapt to it. And by no means, no forest management plans are meant to be set in stone. They're meant to be living documents. And so I think that's how we're approaching this forest management plan as well. But a key piece of that is lining out what are the strategies so that we have so that we have continuity moving forward, because that's what's needed to set up a research forest and a research platform that's enduring. There needs to be continuity in order to manage this forest at scale, and for the time horizons that we're anticipating, to be able to dig into some of the research questions that have been brought to light in the proposal. So I think we all agree about that and appreciate the feedback and the comments on that. And as far as the analysis and data at this point, I think we also know that we're not going to have a perfect view of what's happening on every single acre of the forest. in the next year. What we're really looking at targeting is what are the data gaps and the data needs that we can identify that are going to help us target our analysis, including this 16 watersheds, sub-watersheds, and the adaptive management, but also the treatment allocations, so that we make sure that we're optimizing how we're setting up this forest based on what's actually there and not based on outdated or incorrect data. And so I think a big part of that is first targeting what it is we need and where it is we think those gaps are, and getting that information, and then moving forward. And like you, many of you have been saying, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. But we do want to make sure that we're making decisions based on accurate information and not outdated information, and that we're not making management decisions that are going to negatively impact, the forest. That we're really doing the best we can with the information that we have. So I think for me, that's the approach that we're taking.
Thanks, Shannon. Katie?
Just add one thing to that it kind of is related to the question that Paul brought up earlier about statistics and experimental design and such as that. That one of probably the most important thing in starting any experiment is, again, knowing where you're starting from and what your baseline is. So if you're, for example, studying stream temperatures, you need to have baseline data on stream temperatures, so that if you then do manipulations, you can begin to understand the mechanisms behind how the manipulations impacted, improved, or decreased your target stream temperatures. And so that piece of this is also really important, and understanding that is a big part of why we want to take some relative baby steps and kind of looking at a couple watersheds, working through some of those processes earlier on, and that whether it's 16 or however number we really focus on the beginning. But that's part of the reasoning behind that, is rather than going in and running, I don't want to say running amok, but just running the experiment on this very large scale initially would be a difficult thing to justify in terms of understanding the ins and outs of some of the data we do have, and how that's going to be how well that's going to serve as the baselines that we need, that the people in the future need. It's not so much us, it's people that'll really be analyzing this data and looking at it 20 and 40 and 60 years down the road. So
Thanks, Katie. Any final thoughts from the advisory committee? And then if not, we'll either way. So if there are, we'll take those, and then we have time for public comment. And so far I have Diana as the single person from the public that's interested in making a comment. Okay. Diana, and I'm going based off of the name on your Zoom identification. So if you're on somebody else's computer, I may have you wrong. Yeah, I think we could hear you there for a moment.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got you. Thanks. Welcome.
Yeah, well, let me introduce myself. I'm Diana Kalyamegi, and I'm interested in the Elliott Forest because I go up there a lot and take photography of specifically of species. And I'm kind of new to your process, so I'm going to ask a few simple questions. As far as the forest management plan goes, question number one is there also a form of security and patrolling in the future? Because folks will continue to go up there and possibly dump trash or do some target practice. There's a lot of locals that go up there. Most of them treat the forest well, but not all of them. So security, because as a former Park Service brat, I know that my ranger dad spent a lot of time doing that. And it takes the one thing with state parks and national parks and BLM and that whole federal backbone is that you have a GS salary schedule and you're able to hire people to do that kind of maintenance.
Shannon, do you want to briefly touch on the enforcement piece?
Sure, I can touch on that. So the vision for the Elliott is that there would be, I think someone earlier today mentioned Shutter Creek and the fact that we're looking at that as a potential place for the operations of the research forest and kind of the home base. But regardless of where that infrastructure ends up, the goal is for there to be a series of staff associated with the forest, both research and management operations, and that those people would be based in and around the Elliott. There is a vision and a structure for that in the research proposal. Part of that is also, I think, in this public entity that's being sort of figured out, and how the staff on the ground in that public entity has ownership would work, as well as with OSU, the College of Forestry as the managers. But the vision is for there to be a presence in the local community in and around the forest working there.
Thanks, Shannon. And then two more people. So Jeanette and then Francis.
Hi, thank you. Just briefly, I'm just wondering, and I haven't reviewed the whole FMP, but I was wondering if the logs will be milled locally. I know they have to be processed a little bit. They call it the cans, where they just cut off 3 sides from public land. But I was wondering if the whole log will be processed locally. And then I was also wondering about compliance with the governor's executive order on carbon policy, because I haven't read a lot about climate change in the documents I have read. And then, like I talked about last night, I think it's really important to look at the role of soil fungi in carbon sequestration. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks. And Shannon, I'll ask you if you can briefly, some of these are big, robust topics and difficult to answer in just a short response, but if there's a way to address any of that briefly, that'd be helpful.
Sure. I would just say, and Tom and Katie, please feel free to jump in if you have anything additional. I think the point that you brought up last night around soil research and soil microbial mycorrhizal activity, as we discussed and Tom discussed last night, I think that is a key part of the research that people would want to be doing on the forest, and would be a piece of what's happening there. As far as local mills, supporting local economies is part of the vision for the forest and the research proposal. That's not to say that 100% of the operations would contribute to local economy or be milled locally, but the goal, and that's being outlined further, is that the activities, including the research, recreation, and educational activities, as well as the management activities, would contribute to help supporting local economies, and that there would also be research on that effect as well, kind of wrapped into the vision for this forest.
Thanks for the comments, questions, and response. Paul, did you want to speak specifically to that element?
Yeah. This will be a state-owned asset, and as such, domestic processing is required. As for manufacture of cans, that market hasn't existed for decades. It's a boogeyman that doesn't exist.
Thanks, Paul. And then Francis.
Hello.
Hi there, we got you.
I'm wondering about species that are protected under the Endangered Species Act and how they fit into the forest management plan. Now, I know several of them were included in their habitat conservation plan, and several of them were not. And does anyone know how many species protected under the ESA are on the Elliott but not in that habitat conservation plan? Is it just one, coastal martin, or are there more? Okay, so nobody knows.
So I think I see Shannon, again, these are complex topics, but if there's a brief response, we'll try to offer it here. Shannon, do you want to, it looked like you came off mute.
Yeah, just very briefly, I can say that as far as the management strategy and conservation strategy on the Elliott, we of course have the HCP, as you mentioned, Francis, that we're working with, but the conservation strategies in the forest management plan are not necessarily tied only to the species covered in the HCP, and so that's something that we'll also be detailing out further. As far as the details of your question about the number of species, I'd have to follow up with you on that conversation.
Okay, thanks. I know at least the coastal martin is protected, but not included in the HCP. So we're told it will be completely described and protected under the forest management plan. So I would hope that it would get its own subheading since it wasn't in the HCP. And under the forest management plan outline, you know, the northern spotted owl gets its own subheading, you know, marble murrelet, but those already were well described in the HCP. True. Then there's something called other species. So that must be the coastal martin and other species. So I was just unclear on what that other species meant. Was it other wildlife species in general, or was it other wildlife species that are protected under the ESA, but not in the HCP?
That's a good question. And so I think at this stage with that table of contents, it is a high level draft and we'll be digging into additional information as we've discussed for a couple of other cases to make sure that it's clear about what's covered in each of those sections. And coastal martin has definitely is on our radar. It's a species that we've gotten input on that it's one of special interest and concern on the Elliott. And so that's something that even though it's not covered in the HCP, we do have the coastal martin on our radar as a species to look at in this forest management plan and in our conservation strategy.
I would also just add that I think there's a lot of imperiled species on the Elliott. I think about mussels that are proposed for listing. I think about stream dwelling amphibians. I think about songbird species that are in decline, interior habitat species that are in decline. So I think it's important that we get a handle on a fairly wide array of species and how this plan affects them or doesn't.
Thanks. Great. And with that, I'll see if anybody from the advisory committee has closing thoughts, reactions before we wrap up.
Could I just say one quick thing? It's Barb down here on the river. Hello. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Hello. Oh, hi. Hi. Just a quick follow-up on the one public comment someone just made about the stability of some federal funding, such as the national parks have with the BLM and the forestry department, all of that, not state affiliated, because we seem to have a problem with funding unless we cut trees. So I just really want to reiterate the NOAA federal funding proposition, and which is federal funding and protect all the old trees. And as long as we cut nothing over 65 years old and stay out of those native stands, we'll be doing just fine as neighbors. Thank you.
Thanks, Barb. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye. Yep.
So as we wrap up, just a reminder to folks, we have a full advisory committee meeting coming up. I believe it's on the 15th. Your input is appreciated. I think as you think more about today's presentation, the conversation, if you have really specific needs and elements that your expectations for thinking about a deliverable, a draft document in December of 2022, or Bob, to your point, and Shannon, your affirmation of actually that's November with a presentation in December, but what your expectations are for what would be in such a document. I think the clearer we can be as a group about what exactly the expectations are for what would be done and completed and what would continue on in a further development beyond that December timeline, I think it'd be really helpful to be direct and clear about those expectations and talk through any remaining uncertainty about what can be delivered or not sooner rather than later. What we don't want is to get to that timeline and have expectations not met up. So if you have additional suggestions, advisory committee members, please share them with the OSU team. It would be helpful to have that, even to the extent possible, even prior to the upcoming advisory committee meeting, but certainly as soon as possible. That said, sure appreciate everybody's time, participation, the work of the OSU team in putting together the presentation and responding to great feedback from the committee and suggestions. So with that, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see y'all soon. Thanks.